The rain came down hard on the naval outpost, the kind of heavy storm that drowned footsteps and blurred the sight of even the sharpest eyes. Soldiers hurried under tin roofs and concrete awnings, their boots splashing through puddles as they moved from one barrack to another. Orders barked from officers cut through the roar of thunder, and the entire base pulsed with restless energy, like something unseen was about to happen. Yet in one quiet corner, almost hidden from the eyes of those who thought they knew every name and every face here, sat a woman whose identity was as unremarkable as it was shrouded in mystery. She was neither enlisted, nor ranked, nor even officially on the roster of the base, but her presence carried a weight no one could quite explain. The troops called her Ghost because she moved without being noticed, spoke little, and was always where she was needed before anyone thought to look for her. No one knew her real name, no one knew her past, but when the SEAL commander himself passed by, his stern expression softened, and he would nod as if acknowledging an equal. Her small bunk was tucked behind the supply depot, a place reserved for overflow crates and spare rations. She never complained about the leaking roof or the chill wind that crept through the cracks, never asked for better quarters. She seemed almost untouchable by discomfort, moving like a shadow in faded fatigues that had no insignia stitched upon them. The younger recruits whispered about her constantly. Some said she had once been a decorated operative who abandoned her rank after a mission went wrong. Others swore she was an intelligence agent too valuable to be named, too dangerous to be acknowledged. A few even whispered that she didn't exist on any record, not in the Navy, not in the CIA, not even in the world itself. Yet when drills began and the men sweated through obstacle courses or target ranges, she was there, silent, executing each movement with flawless precision, as if her body itself was built from discipline and experience far beyond the rest of them. They tried to match her, but none could. On the day of the commander's visit, tension ran high. The SEALs stood sharp in formation, boots aligned, rifles gleaming, breaths controlled. Commander Briggs was not the kind of man to tolerate mistakes. His reputation was carved in battlefields across the globe, his voice said to cut through fear itself. When he walked across the yard, silence followed him like a tide. Yet when his gaze fell on her, sitting off to the side polishing a rifle that was not hers, his steps slowed. The soldiers noticed. They dared not speak, but their eyes flickered between the giant of a commander and the unranked woman, waiting for reprimand, perhaps for an order to have her removed. Instead, the commander stopped and for the first time in years, he extended his hand. A simple gesture, but one that told every hardened SEAL present that respect was not bound by rank, nor granted by uniform. It was earned and somehow she had earned his. What the others didn't know was that weeks earlier, during a covert training mission in the mountains, disaster had struck. A squad had been caught in a landslide after an unexpected detonation triggered loose stone. Radios were buried, maps destroyed, and men scattered. Panic would have broken them if not for her. She appeared like she had been waiting for it, pulling soldiers from the rubble with strength that belied her frame, stitching wounds with hands that moved like they had done it 1,000 times, guiding them wordlessly down narrow goat trails until the extraction chopper found them. Not a single man from that squad ever spoke of it in detail, but the way they looked at her afterwards, like survivors looking at the hand of fate, was enough to fuel the rumors. None of them had reported her actions officially because no one could explain how she had been there in the first place, but word traveled in silence, in the way respect travels, not shouted but felt. When the commander shook her hand that day, it wasn't ceremony, it wasn't theatrics. It was acknowledgement. The men stiffened their spines even more, realizing that if their iron-hearted leader could show her honor, then she was someone far beyond the stories whispered in the barracks. Yet she said nothing. She never bowed, never smiled, never spoke more than a few necessary words. She simply nodded back, eyes calm, and returned to cleaning the rifle as though nothing had happened. But that was the moment the outpost changed. For the first time, every soldier there knew that their hierarchy was not absolute, that greatness could hide in the unranked, that legends did not always wear medals. The storm grew harsher that evening, and with it came a new mission briefing. An intelligence leak had revealed hostile activity near the coastal cliffs, where insurgents had been smuggling weapons through hidden tunnels carved into the stone. The SEALs were preparing for a nighttime incursion, silent insertion by sea followed by demolition of the tunnels. It was a mission as dangerous as it was vital. But the commander's words surprised everyone. "She goes with you." A murmur rippled through the room. Officially, she had no clearance, no designation, no role. Yet the order was final. None questioned it aloud. If the commander had spoken, it was law. And so the anonymous woman, without rank, without file, without name, was placed into the company of the most elite fighting force in the world. and no one dared object. The boat ride out into the Black Sea was cold and merciless, salt spray slapping against faces hidden beneath night vision goggles and balaclavas. The only sound was the roar of the motor beneath the surface and the occasional hand signal flashed between men. She sat at the bow, motionless, eyes fixed on the dark cliffs ahead as if she could already see what lay hidden within. There was no nervousness in her, no shifting of weight, no hesitation in her posture. She was carved from focus, from an unspoken certainty that made even the veterans glance at her when fear crept into their veins. And when the engines cut and the boat slid into silence, it was her hand that first tightened around the rope, her body that moved with silent certainty into the waves. What awaited them on those cliffs would test every fiber of their training, every ounce of their courage. But none of them could deny it anymore. Whatever her past, whoever she really was, she was one of them. More than that, she was something even they could not define and perhaps never would. And though anonymous, though unranked, she had already become the figure they looked toward when the shadows thickened. They didn't know her name, but they would follow her into fire. The climb up the cliff was brutal. The rope cut into their gloves as the sea wind whipped against them, salt burning their eyes, waves crashing below like hungry jaws waiting for a single mistake. The SEALs moved in practiced silence, each body pressed against the slick stone, each movement rehearsed 1,000 times in training. But this night, training felt like a memory compared to the reality of jagged rock and blind darkness. And there she was, leading without command, her figure moving with such certainty that even the most hardened climbers found themselves following her pace, matching her rhythm, unconsciously treating her as their anchor. Not a single grunt of effort escaped her lips, not even when the cliff's sharp edges tore the skin from her knuckles. When they reached the top, she was the first to vanish into the grass, crouched low, scanning the black horizon like she had been born in shadow. The mission plan was precise. Recon first, demolition second, exfil third. The tunnels beneath the cliff were rumored to hold enough weapons to supply insurgents for months, maybe years, and if they weren't destroyed tonight, the cost in lives could spiral beyond measure. But plans are fragile things, easily shattered by the reality of war. She signaled once, 2 fingers forward, 1 down, and without question the squad shifted. The strange part was that none of them had been taught her signals, yet every man seemed to understand instinctively. It was as if her movements spoke a language older than tactics, something primal that transcended training. They advanced, boots sinking into wet soil, hearts hammering behind layers of gear and discipline. When they reached the mouth of the first tunnel, guarded by 2 men with rifles slung lazily across their shoulders, it was she who stepped forward. The soldiers expected her to draw a blade, maybe strike from the shadows. But instead, she slipped behind them with such grace that they never even twitched before both were on the ground, unconscious, their weapons untouched. No wasted motion, no noise. Just silence. Inside the tunnels, the air was damp and heavy, stinking of oil and rusted iron. Crates lined the walls, marked with foreign insignia, filled with rifles, explosives, and contraband. The squad moved in pairs, checking every corner, every shadow. She was always ahead, her steps so quiet they could barely be heard, her eyes cutting through darkness even before their night vision lenses adjusted. At one point, when a hidden tripwire nearly caught the point man, it was her hand that shot out, stopping him an inch before disaster. She crouched, studied the wire, and disarmed it in seconds. The men exchanged quick glances but said nothing. Respect grew in silence, the kind that carved itself deep into memory. By the time they reached the central chamber of the tunnels, they all knew she was more than rumor. She was survival itself. But survival is never guaranteed. The insurgents struck suddenly, a burst of gunfire that shattered the silence and turned the tunnel into chaos. Bullets sparked against stone, shouts echoed, grenades rattled across the ground. The squad returned fire with ruthless precision, but the enemy numbers were greater than expected. Smoke filled the chamber, thick and choking, the kind that blinded even the most trained fighters. In that storm of noise and death, it was her voice, calm, sharp, unyielding, that cut through. Left flank, 3 incoming. Suppress. Right tunnel, block now. Her tone carried no rank, no authority, yet every man obeyed without hesitation. The orders were flawless, the instincts perfect. She moved like lightning, pulling a wounded soldier back behind cover, firing controlled bursts that dropped enemies before they could reload. When one of the insurgents charged with a knife, she met him head-on, a blur of fists and steel, and he was down before his blade even touched air. The squad fought harder because she fought harder. They held the line because she made it possible. When the smoke cleared, bodies littered the ground. The SEALs were bruised, bleeding, breathing hard, but alive. Against the odds, they had secured the chamber. Explosives were placed against the weapon crates, charges set to bring the tunnels down. But as they prepared to exfil, she froze. Her eyes caught something on the far wall, a hidden passage barely wider than a man's shoulders, disguised behind stacked crates. Without waiting for approval, she moved toward it. The commander of the squad hissed after her, warning her to hold position, but she ignored it. Something in her stride made the others follow anyway. The passage led to a second chamber, smaller, quieter, but filled with something far more dangerous than rifles. Maps, plans, communication equipment. And in the center, a single metal case marked with a seal no one recognized. She touched it once as if confirming something only she understood, then turned to the squad. "This goes with us," she said. For the first time, her words were not a suggestion but a command. And none dared refuse. The retreat was harder. Reinforcements had arrived, insurgents pouring into the tunnels like hornets stirred from a nest. Gunfire chased them, grenades shattered walls, dust and rock rained down as the charges they had set ticked toward detonation. But somehow, through every corner and crossfire, she led them out. She shielded the rear when bullets sprayed, she dragged the injured when legs gave out, she found cover where none seemed possible. When they finally burst from the mouth of the cliffside tunnel, the ocean stretched below, black and endless, extraction boats waiting in the distance. She didn't pause. She threw a smoke canister, signaling the boats, then urged the men down the ropes before she herself descended, the last to leave the cursed tunnels. Behind them, fire erupted as the charges detonated, collapsing the cliffs into the sea. The mission was complete. The weapons destroyed. The case secured. Against the odds, they had survived. Back on the boats, silence hung heavier than the salt air. The men sat exhausted, battered, bleeding, staring at her as though she were something not entirely human. She sat quietly at the bow again, her expression unchanged, her breathing steady despite the chaos they had endured. When the commander of the squad tried to thank her, she shook her head once as if dismissing the need for words. But the respect in their eyes could not be dismissed. It was earned in blood, in fire, in shadows. They had entered that mission with an anonymous figure, a ghost among them. They left it with something more, a leader who needed no rank to be followed. When they returned to base, Commander Briggs was waiting. He looked at the battered squad, then at the case clutched in one soldier's arms. But his eyes rested longest on her. For a moment, silence stretched between them, the kind of silence that speaks louder than words. Then, in front of every soldier gathered, he saluted her. Not a nod, not a handshake this time, but the salute of a commander honoring an equal. And though she remained nameless, unranked, she returned the gesture with the same sharpness as any soldier who had ever worn the uniform. The base was alive with rumors after their return. Word spread faster than orders could contain it. Every corridor, every mess hall, every dim-lit barack echoed with whispers of the nameless woman who had fought like a phantom in the tunnels. The younger recruits spoke of her as though she were a myth, a story passed between them to steady their nerves. Veterans were quieter, but their silence carried weight, the kind that comes from seeing something they could not explain. She did not bask in it, did not change her routine. She still slept in her corner bunk behind the supply depot, still moved without sound, still carried no name. But the eyes that followed her were different now. She was no longer just the ghost of the base. She was something more. Even the commander, who rarely wasted time on words, kept her in his line of sight, studying her like a puzzle no man could solve. Days after the mission, debriefings filled the schedule. Reports were filed, strategies reviewed, every moment dissected under the cold light of military procedure. Yet whenever her actions came up, silence fell. How could they write her into reports? She had no name, no designation, no official existence. Still, the commander's word was enough. "She stays," he told the senior officers. "She goes where we go." None dared challenge it. In the hierarchy of men who had killed and bled for every inch of respect they carried, his authority was unquestioned. But beneath the surface, tension simmered. Some officers were uneasy with her presence, with the way soldiers seemed to follow her without orders, with the way respect clung to her without effort. To them she was a disruption, a shadow they could not control. And shadows in the military were dangerous. Her next test came sooner than expected. Intelligence intercepted chatter of a convoy moving across the desert, carrying high-value targets and experimental weapon prototypes meant to be traded on the black market. Stopping it required precision, speed, and absolute ruthlessness. The SEALs were assigned, and though she was not named in the orders when they geared up, she was there. No one stopped her. It felt natural now, like she was stitched into the fabric of the team. The desert greeted them with scorching heat by day and freezing winds by night, endless dunes stretching beneath skies as wide as eternity. The convoy moved fast, armored trucks kicking up trails of dust, guarded by mercenaries who were neither poorly trained nor poorly armed. This was not a mission of stealth, it was war in the open with seconds to decide who lived and who died. They struck at twilight, when the sun bled orange across the horizon and shadows stretched long like claws. The ambush was swift, rifles cracking, rockets streaking fire across the sand. The convoy erupted into chaos, trucks skidding, guards firing blindly into the dunes. The SEALs advanced with brutal precision, every movement measured, every shot deliberate. She was at the front, moving faster than any of them, weaving between bursts of gunfire, her aim flawless. When a guard emerged behind an overturned vehicle, ready to cut down half the squad, she dropped him with a single shot that looked effortless. When an armored truck turned its mounted gun toward them, she sprinted into the open, slid beneath its line of fire, and tossed a charge that ripped it apart in a roar of flames. The men around her fought harder because she fought harder. Even in the desert storm of bullets and dust, she was unshaken. But the mission was not without cost. One soldier was pinned behind a burning truck, his leg torn by shrapnel, enemies closing in on him. The squad leader hesitated, torn between orders and survival. She did not hesitate. She broke from cover, sprinting through a hail of bullets, her body moving with a recklessness that seemed almost insane. Yet somehow she reached him, dragging him back under fire, shielding him with her own body until the others suppressed the attackers. Bullets tore into the sand around them, flames licked at their heels, but she never slowed. When they finally pulled him into safety, the soldier looked at her with wide eyes, whispering words that echoed long after, "You shouldn't be alive." She only shook her head, wiping the dust from her face. "Neither should you. But here we are." By the time the last truck burned and the dust settled, the desert was a graveyard of steel and smoke. The convoy was destroyed, the weapons secured. But the case again, a second one, sealed, heavy, with the same strange insignia as the one they had taken from the tunnels, was found in the wreckage. She was the one who picked it up, her fingers lingering on its surface like it was familiar. The others noticed, but none questioned her. Not yet. When the extraction helicopter lifted them from the sand, carrying men bruised, burned, but alive, they looked at her with something more than respect. They looked at her with a question none dared voice. "Who are you?" Back at the base, the case was locked in the restricted vaults, guarded by steel and secrecy. The commander demanded answers from higher authorities, but the silence from above was louder than any reply. Whatever was inside, it was not meant for ordinary eyes. But the commander's instincts told him one thing clearly: she knew more than she let on. That night, he found her alone, sitting outside by the chain-link fence that bordered the base, staring into the darkness as if searching for something beyond the horizon. He didn't sit beside her. He stood, hands clasped behind his back, his voice low. "You fought like one of us. Better than most of us. But you're not one of us. Tell me why you're here." For the first time since he had known her, she spoke more than a handful of words. "I'm here because what's coming isn't something you can fight with ranks or medals. It's something you can only fight with belief." He frowned, the words foreign even to a man who had lived his life in war. But before he could question further, she stood and walked away, leaving only silence behind. Her presence began to change more than missions. It changed men. Soldiers who once cared only for orders and survival found themselves thinking differently. They trusted more, feared less, believed in something greater than themselves. She carried no rank, yet her influence rippled through the base like an invisible current. The officers noticed, unease growing sharper. But the commander noticed too, and unlike them, he did not fear it. He recognized it. In his career, he had seen men earn respect with bullets, medals, scars. She earned it with something deeper. Something even he could not name. And though whispers of her past grew louder, though questions swirled like dust storms in the desert, no one had an answer. Only the certainty that when the next mission came, she would be there. Anonymous, unranked, but essential. And the next mission was already on the horizon, darker and more dangerous than any before. The kind of mission that would test not just their bodies but their souls. And every soldier knew with a certainty carved into their bones, that if she was with them, they had a chance. Without her, they had none. The weeks that followed moved with a strange weight, as though the base itself held its breath. Missions continued, training never ceased, yet everything seemed to orbit around her presence. Soldiers who had once competed to prove themselves in front of commanders now found themselves trying to keep pace with her, studying her movements, listening to her words even when they were few. She spoke rarely, but when she did, her voice carried more than sound, it carried conviction. The nameless woman had become a force, one that could not be ignored. And then came the orders that would push all of them beyond the edge of what they thought possible. A deep strike into enemy territory far past friendly lines, where intelligence claimed a hidden facility controlled operations that threatened half a continent. It was not a mission for the faint-hearted. It was suicide, dressed in the thin cloth of strategy. But when the commander briefed them, his voice cold and hard, his eyes found her. "If anyone can lead us through this," he said, "it's her." The insertion was brutal. A midnight flight in a blacked-out transport, parachutes cutting silently through the cold upper winds, bodies descending into a jungle that swallowed sound. The canopy closed over them like the mouth of a beast, branches clawing, insects shrieking, air so thick with humidity it felt alive. The team regrouped in silence, weapons ready, nerves stretched tight. She was already moving, her eyes scanning the shadows as though the jungle whispered secrets to her alone. They followed without question, each man stepping where she stepped, breathing when she breathed. Hours passed in the suffocating dark, broken only by the distant rumble of engines and the metallic clatter of machinery buried deep in the earth. The facility was close. Too close. And with every step, the jungle seemed to resist them, as if the land itself wished to keep its secrets. When they reached the outer perimeter, the scale of the place struck them. Concrete walls rose from the earth like a fortress, crowned with razor wire and floodlights that carved the night apart. Guard towers loomed, their rifles scanning the jungle. Vehicles rolled in and out through steel gates, carrying crates marked with the same insignia as the cases they had recovered before. Whatever this place was, it tied everything together. The team huddled in the undergrowth, breaths measured, eyes locked on her. She studied the walls, the patrols, the rhythm of the lights. And then, without a word, she began to move. Low, silent, weaving between shadows, her body a part of the night. The squad followed, hearts hammering, every sense sharpened to a blade's edge. Minutes felt like hours as they slipped through the perimeter, cutting fences, disabling cameras, sliding past guards who never knew they had been there. It was perfect. Too perfect. And when they reached the interior courtyard, the trap was sprung. Floodlights roared to life, a blinding storm of white. Alarms screamed, gunfire erupted from every direction. The facility had known they were coming. Ambush. The squad hit the ground, returning fire, bullets cracking, grenades shaking the air. Men shouted, blood sprayed, the jungle itself seemed to convulse. They were outnumbered, outgunned, caught in a kill box designed to erase them from existence. Yet in the chaos she stood. Calm. Focused. Her voice cut through the storm. South Tower. Take it down. Cover left. Move now. She fired with precision that made the impossible possible, dropping enemies before they could adjust their aim, leading the squad with instincts sharper than any radar. They fought like men possessed, like survival itself was wrapped in her words. And somehow, impossibly, they broke through. Bodies littered the courtyard, smoke choked the air, alarms wailed into the night. The SEALs pressed forward, breaching doors, storming hallways. The facility would not hold. Inside, the scale of the operation revealed itself. Endless corridors filled with machinery, rooms stacked with weapon stockpiles, data servers humming with stolen intelligence. It was not just a base. It was the heart of something larger, something far-reaching. As the squad split to plant charges, she moved deeper, drawn by something unseen. The commander noticed, but he did not stop her. Somehow, he trusted that whatever guided her would guide them all. Down a stairwell, through reinforced doors, into a chamber colder and quieter than the rest. And there, under harsh lights, stood rows of cases identical to the ones they had already recovered. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, lined like coffins waiting for their dead. She froze, her breath steady but her eyes burning with something the others could not read. She stepped forward, her hand brushing one of the cases, and whispered words too soft to catch. But they were enough. They told the commander what he had suspected all along. She knew. The retreat was madness. Explosives planted, charges ticking, alarms screaming, enemy reinforcements pouring in from every direction. The squad fought through hallways that felt endless, their rifles running hot, their bodies running on nothing but willpower. She led every turn, every push, her instincts a map through the chaos. When the charges blew, the ground shook, walls collapsed, fire consumed steel. The facility roared as if the earth itself rejected it. They burst into the jungle, flames at their backs, helicopters thundering in the sky. Extraction arrived in a storm of rotors and gunfire, cables dropping, soldiers hauling themselves up. She was the last again, always the last, covering them until the final moment before grabbing the rope and ascending into the night. Below, the jungle burned, the facility collapsed into itself, and whatever secrets it had kept were buried in ash and fire. On the flight back, silence filled the transport. Men sat slumped, eyes hollow, skin streaked with soot and blood. Some stared at the floor, others at nothing at all. But every now and then their gaze would find her. She sat as she always did, calm, steady, her eyes closed as if listening to something only she could hear. The commander sat across from her, his jaw tight, his mind racing. He had fought wars across continents, faced enemies that bent nations to their knees, but never had he encountered someone like her. Anonymous, unranked, yet more essential than any soldier he had ever commanded. He wanted answers, but in his gut he already knew, answers would come only when she chose. And perhaps when she did, the world would not be ready. When they returned to base, they were met not with cheers but with silence. The operation had been classified before it even began, their success buried under layers of secrecy. Yet the men carried something more valuable than recognition. They carried survival. And they carried her presence. That night, in the barracks, a soldier spoke words that would spread like wildfire. We followed her into hell. And we came back. From that moment, her legend grew beyond the base. She was not just a ghost. She was a symbol. A reminder that strength was not born from rank, that belief was not pinned to uniforms. She was proof that sometimes the greatest among them wore no name at all. The next morning broke over the base with a stillness that almost felt deceptive, as if the world was holding its breath. The dawn light painted the ocean in molten shades of gold and rose, and the air carried the smell of salt and engine fuel. She woke before most, not because she had to, but because she had grown accustomed to moving when the rest of the world still slept. The silence gave her room to think, to prepare, to steel herself against the storm of scrutiny she knew would come later. Anonymous and unranked, she had already done what many seasoned soldiers couldn't, earned the commander's acknowledgement. But she knew that wasn't the end, it was the beginning of a harsher trial. Recognition, after all, drew attention, and attention invited judgment. She sat on the edge of her cot, pulling her boots on with deliberate care. Each tug of the laces felt like a reminder, her discipline, her resolve, her commitment. Around her, the other women in the barracks stirred slowly, whispering among themselves, some pretending not to look at her while their curiosity betrayed them. A few respected her now, they had seen what she could do. Others, though, watched with narrowed eyes, still trying to reconcile how someone without rank, without a name, could earn honor from the very commander they idolized. She ignored their stares. Their whispers didn't matter. What mattered was what she chose to do next. The training that day was brutal by design. The sun climbed higher, merciless in its glare, and the instructors pushed every group harder than before. Rumors had spread of an upcoming joint exercise, one that would test not only skill but endurance, trust, and adaptability under simulated combat pressure. This wasn't the usual grind, it was preparation for something that would mark reputations. For her, it meant an opportunity. She wasn't fighting for a medal or rank, but every chance to prove herself mattered, not for glory, but to cement her place among those who still doubted her. As the group assembled for a run through the obstacle course, she found herself paired again with Daniels, the man who had once dismissed her outright but had since shifted to a wary respect. His eyes met hers briefly, and there was no contempt there now, only recognition. "You keep surprising people," he muttered under his breath as they waited for the signal. She didn't respond with words, she just gave him a slight nod. Actions had always spoken louder, and she had no intention of letting hers falter. The horn blared and they launched forward. The course was a punishing chain of walls, rope climbs, mud pits, and balance beams set against the relentless heat. Her body moved with a practiced efficiency, each muscle responding to memory and instinct. The mud clung to her clothes, her breath came sharp and fast, and her hands burned from rope fibers digging into skin. But she didn't slow. Where others hesitated at high walls or faltered in the quagmire of mud, she surged ahead, not with reckless speed but with steady, precise determination. By the halfway point, Daniels was panting hard to keep up. Others behind them shouted, cursed, or stumbled. Yet she pressed on, as though the course itself were nothing more than another test of patience. It wasn't just physical, though. Toward the end, when exhaustion set in like lead in her veins, the mental weight bore down. Her mind screamed to ease up, to let the body rest. But she remembered the commander's words, remembered the look in his eyes when he had acknowledged her, not as a soldier by title but as a warrior in spirit. That memory drove her harder than any barked order could. She pushed through, crossing the finish line not with the glory of a sprint but with the steady, unbroken stride of someone who refused to fall. The instructors recorded times, and though she wasn't the absolute fastest, she was among the first to complete it, and the cleanest. No skipped obstacles, no assistance, no shortcuts. The commander himself had arrived during the latter half, watching quietly from the sidelines, though she hadn't noticed until it was over. When her eyes finally met his across the training ground, he gave the smallest of gestures, a nod that most would have overlooked. But to her it was enough. It meant he saw her effort, her refusal to give in, and silently, he honored it again. Later, after the course, fatigue settled deep into her bones. Muscles throbbed, shoulders ached, and her hands were raw with scrapes. She cleaned herself off in the showers, the water stinging like fire against every wound, but she didn't complain. Pain was a teacher, and she had learned long ago to listen. When she returned to the mess hall, conversations hushed briefly before resuming with a hum of speculation. Some glanced at her with a mixture of curiosity and admiration. Daniels approached, tray in hand, and sat across from her. He didn't waste time on small talk. "You're not here just to prove a point, are you?" he asked, his tone sharp but not hostile. She looked at him evenly, her fork paused midway. "I'm here to be more than what people think I am," she replied softly but firmly. The simplicity of her words carried a weight he didn't challenge. Instead, he leaned back, studying her like someone reevaluating a puzzle piece that never seemed to fit until now. "Whatever your reason is, you're making the rest of us work harder," he admitted, almost grudgingly. She gave the faintest hint of a smile at that because in truth, that was part of her purpose. Not to overshadow but to raise the bar, to show what was possible. That night, as darkness fell and the stars spread like scattered fire across the sky, she stood alone near the training field. The ocean roared in the distance, constant and unyielding, a reminder of the greater battles beyond these walls. Her thoughts drifted to the unknown paths ahead. She was still anonymous, still unranked, yet piece by piece she was building something no badge or medal could capture. She was earning respect, not because of authority, but because of who she chose to be in the face of challenge. And though she stood alone in that moment, she wasn't unseen. From the shadows of the command building, the SEAL commander watched her again, silent as ever. He didn't need to say anything. His quiet acknowledgement spoke volumes. In a world where titles defined worth, he had seen hers without needing one. And that, to her, was enough fuel to keep walking the path, no matter how rough it became. The days that followed the mission were a blur of debriefings, recovery drills, and the strange quiet that always seemed to settle on the base after something monumental had happened. She walked among the men as if nothing had changed, as if she were still the unranked, unnamed shadow they had known from the beginning, but the atmosphere was different now. The men looked at her not with doubt but with an odd mixture of respect and quiet reverence, the kind they usually reserved only for legends of the past. Even though she still refused to put on a uniform or claim any kind of rank, her presence carried weight, and no one dared to question her place among them anymore. Some of the younger recruits even followed her silently when she went for runs, hoping to match her pace or learn something from the way she moved, but she never turned to acknowledge them. She simply kept going, steady and untouchable like she always had. The SEAL commander himself had grown almost accustomed to her defiance of structure, though he would never say it aloud. He saw her in the training yard late at night, alone, pushing her body past exhaustion when most men would have collapsed hours earlier. He saw her on the mats, sparring 3 or 4 of the best fighters at once, always walking away with bruises but never defeated. He knew that she lived by some code older than the Navy, older than their rules, something forged out of necessity and survival rather than tradition, and though it unsettled him at times, he had grown to accept that her way had its own kind of authority. There was, however, something restless in her eyes that no victory or recognition seemed to quiet. She spent long stretches of time staring at maps, tracing routes in silence, as though waiting for something to happen, as though the mission they had survived was not an ending but the beginning of something larger. The men whispered about it in the bunks, wondering if she was planning to disappear one night without a word. Some believed she was only passing through, a phantom lending them strength before vanishing back into whatever shadows she had come from. Others thought she had found a new purpose with them, that perhaps she might even stay, but no one dared ask her directly. The commander, though, did. One night, he approached her in the dimly lit operations room, where she stood alone, studying satellite images of terrain far from their theater of operations. He asked her bluntly if she intended to remain with them or if she was planning to leave, his voice quiet but firm, carrying the weight of someone who needed an answer not just for himself but for the men who looked up to her. She turned slowly, her expression unreadable, her eyes holding his for a long moment before she spoke. She told him she had no rank, no file, and no future within their system, that staying would only create conflict in the chain of command, and yet she admitted, almost reluctantly, that she was not ready to walk away just yet. There was unfinished business, she said, though she did not explain further, and for reasons she could not fully name, she felt tied to this group in a way she had not felt tied to anyone in a very long time. The commander accepted her answer with a slight nod, though deep down he knew it was only a temporary reprieve. She was like the tide, inevitable in her coming and her going. For the next few weeks, she threw herself into everything with relentless intensity, from planning small-scale training missions to guiding the men through grueling physical drills. They began to rely on her instincts in ways that surprised even themselves, and when she spoke, they listened as though her words carried the weight of lived truth. There were no medals, no promotions, no official recognition, but everyone knew who they would follow when it mattered. One evening, during a strategy session, an alert came through that would shift the entire course of their operations. Intelligence indicated that remnants of the same enemy cell they had struck earlier were regrouping in an unexpected location, gathering strength and planning a counterattack against Allied forces. It was dangerous, the terrain unforgiving, and the timeline brutally short. The commander looked at her across the table without saying a word, and she simply gave a slight nod. She was already committed before the others even had a chance to react. The mission began before dawn, the unit moving through rugged terrain under cover of darkness. The air was heavy, the kind of silence that seemed to amplify every step, every breath. She led from the middle, not the front, always aware of each man's position, adjusting her pace and movements to keep the formation tight and undetected. When the first signs of enemy patrols appeared, she made quick, precise hand signals, guiding them into positions that avoided confrontation but still kept them on track. The commander, watching her work, realized with startling clarity that she had become the pulse of the team. They were operating at a level beyond cohesion. They were a living organism, and she was its steady, unseen heartbeat. The firefight, when it came, was brutal and sudden. The enemy had been prepared, more organized than expected, and the air erupted with the deafening chaos of gunfire, explosions, and shouted commands. She moved like a shadow in the midst of it, never reckless, always precise, covering weak points, dragging a wounded man to safety while laying down fire with seamless accuracy. At one point, when the unit was pinned against a ridge with no clear way forward, it was her calm, steady voice that cut through the noise, directing a flanking maneuver that turned the tide in their favor. Hours later, when the smoke cleared and the mission was finally declared a success, the men were exhausted, battered, but alive. The enemy camp was destroyed, their plans shattered, and the unit had once again done what many thought impossible. She sat on the edge of a broken wall, her rifle across her knees, breathing hard but steady, her eyes scanning the horizon as if already preparing for the next fight. The men moved around her with an unspoken sense of gratitude and awe, some too drained to even put words to what they felt. The commander approached quietly, standing beside her for a long moment before speaking. He told her that whatever she claimed about being anonymous and unranked, it no longer mattered. She had done what few could ever do, not just surviving but leading, not just fighting but inspiring, and for that, she had earned honor in the eyes of every man present. She did not answer, only gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile, but in her eyes, there was something softer than before, a flicker of acceptance that perhaps, even without a name or a rank, she belonged here after all. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the compound shrouded in mist that clung to the earth like breath rising from a wounded body. She walked slowly across the open ground, her boots sinking into the softened mud, her gaze steady as the sun broke weakly through the clouds. Around her, men who had fought battles across continents and oceans paused what they were doing, their eyes following her as if instinct told them to hold their silence. She had no rank stitched onto her uniform, no medals gleaming on her chest, but there was something about the way she moved, the way her presence carried weight heavier than iron, that made even the most decorated officers hold their breath when she passed. A day ago she had saved them all, not because she had been ordered to, not because she sought recognition, but because she had chosen to step into the fire when hesitation would have meant death for everyone. The SEAL commander had not said much during the aftermath. He had stood beside her as they evacuated the wounded, watching the helicopters lift from the compound, his face unreadable under the strain of exhaustion. Only later, in the quiet of the command tent, when the reports were being written and the decisions replayed, had he spoken. His voice had been steady, deliberate, as he acknowledged that without her intervention they would have lost the mission and perhaps the team itself. Those words, coming from a man who had buried more brothers in arms than anyone should, carried a gravity that could not be measured in commendations or ribbons. He hadn't called her soldier, or officer, or hero. He had called her by her name, a simple gesture that felt like the highest honor anyone could give. Now the camp buzzed with activity again. Supply trucks rumbled in, engineers checked the defenses, and the younger recruits whispered stories of what she had done as if retelling a legend. She ignored them as she always had, her focus on the work in front of her. There was no satisfaction in glory, not for her. She had seen too many bodies lowered into the dirt to mistake applause for anything more than passing noise. But still, she couldn't ignore the way the air shifted whenever the commander entered the space. He didn't look at her often, yet when he did there was a flicker in his eyes, not awe, not gratitude, but recognition. As if he knew something about her that no one else could see, as if he understood the burden she carried in silence. The night came heavy and cold. Lanterns burned low in the command post, maps spread out across the tables, radio chatter cutting through the static. She was there again, leaning over the plans, her finger tracing the routes, her voice steady as she suggested adjustments that could mean the difference between survival and slaughter. No one questioned her, not anymore. Even the seasoned veterans had learned that when she spoke, it was not theory, it was the raw instinct of someone who had stood too close to the edge and lived to tell the story. The commander listened, nodding slightly, his jaw set tight. At the end, he dismissed the others but asked her to stay. They stood in silence for a long moment, the hum of the equipment filling the air. Then, in a voice softer than the one he used with his men, he told her what he had decided. He would write her into the report, not just as a footnote, not just as support, but as the key factor in why they had come back alive. She shook her head immediately, her expression sharp, her voice low as she told him she wanted none of that. Recognition was a chain, she said, and chains had a way of pulling people down. What mattered was the mission, the lives saved, not her name on a document. For a moment his expression hardened, as if he would argue. But then something shifted. He exhaled slowly, his shoulders dropping, and for the first time she saw something in him other than command and discipline. She saw respect, deep and unshakable, the kind that was rarely given and never taken lightly. He didn't push further. Instead, he told her she had earned something greater than recognition. She had earned his trust. And in their world, trust was rarer than gold. The days passed, each one bleeding into the next, operations running, plans shifting, men moving under orders. Yet everywhere she went, she felt the echo of that trust. The SEALs gave her space in their circle, the kind of silent acceptance that didn't need to be spoken. She was not one of them by rank or by badge, but she had walked into fire beside them and come out standing, and that was enough. She carried herself the same as ever, her silence steady, her eyes watchful, but inside she knew that something had changed. For once she was not fighting alone. It was a strange thing being honored without ceremony. There were no trumpets, no medals pinned to her chest, no headlines to capture her name. There was only the quiet shift of shoulders when she entered a room, the pause in voices, the subtle nods from men who had seen her stand unflinching in the storm. It was enough, more than enough, though sometimes in the quiet hours she wondered if it was also dangerous. The higher you rose in the eyes of warriors, the heavier their expectations became. She feared that one day she would falter, and all those who had placed faith in her would see the cracks. But then she reminded herself, she had never sought their faith. She had only ever sought to do what had to be done, and that would never change. The commander remained distant, as commanders must, yet there were moments when the mask slipped. A glance across the field, a nod during a briefing, a single line spoken in private that carried more weight than a dozen speeches. He never raised his voice when addressing her, never pulled rank, never tried to confine her spirit to the neat lines of military structure. Instead, he treated her as an equal, not because she had demanded it, but because she had earned it. That was the kind of honor she carried now, one that could not be stripped away by paper or forgotten by time. And so she remained anonymous to the world, unranked by any system, unseen by any official recognition. Yet among those who mattered, among men hardened by fire and loss, she had been honored in the only way that counted. Not with medals or words, but with trust, respect, and the quiet acknowledgement of the SEAL commander himself. The final confrontation between Karen and my family arrived sooner than anyone expected. After weeks of back-and-forth battles, legal threats, intimidation, and public embarrassment, she decided to make her grand move. The HOA scheduled an emergency meeting, one where Karen planned to announce a sweeping motion to strip my family of ownership rights over our land. She was so confident in her scheme that she even invited local reporters, hoping to broadcast her victory live. My father, however, anticipated every detail. As a retired 4-star general, he knew how to plan for a confrontation not just on a battlefield but also in social and legal arenas. He wore his decorated uniform that day, medals polished, rank insignia gleaming. It wasn't about intimidation, it was about presence. Karen thought she was walking into a victory celebration, but she was actually marching straight into her greatest defeat. When we entered the community hall, the room was already buzzing. Karen stood at the front, speaking with exaggerated energy, her red folder of evidence clutched like it was the key to a kingdom. The board members sat stiffly behind her, clearly nervous. Residents filled every seat, whispering and trading rumors. The reporters set up their cameras, waiting for the drama. Karen spotted us immediately. Her smile faltered, but she quickly forced it back, as though determined to ignore the fact that we had dared to walk in. "Ah," she said into the microphone, her voice dripping with condescension, "the troublemakers have arrived. Just in time to witness the decision that will restore order to our community." My father didn't flinch. He simply walked to the center of the room, his boots clicking against the polished floor. The crowd instinctively quieted, the presence of authority commanding silence without him saying a word. He raised his hand slightly and spoke in a calm, steady tone. "Before you begin your performance, Karen," he said, his voice carrying easily without need for a microphone, "I think these people deserve to hear the truth. Not the distorted stories you've been spinning, but the reality of what's been happening here." Karen scoffed, flipping open her folder. "The truth? You mean the truth that your family has been violating every rule of this neighborhood? That you've been running a nuisance operation on land that doesn't even belong to you? Please, don't embarrass yourself." My father's eyes narrowed slightly. "You're right about one thing. This land doesn't belong to me." He paused, letting the silence sharpen. "It belongs to the United States government. More specifically, to the Department of Defense. And by extension, to every American taxpayer." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The reporters immediately perked up, cameras adjusting focus. Karen's face drained of color. What are you talking about?" she stammered. My father calmly produced a thick envelope from his case and set it on the table. "This is the deed, the zoning map, and the military contract. This entire property, land, roadways, and water access, is federal land, under my stewardship until formal transfer is complete. That means your HOA has been operating illegally, enforcing rules on property it does not control." The board members leaned forward, exchanging panicked looks. Residents began whispering louder, some of them standing up in shock. Karen's eyes darted around the room, searching for support, but she found none. "You can't prove that," she snapped. "This is just another one of your intimidation tactics." "On the contrary," my father replied smoothly. "Not only is it proven, but your actions, harassing my family, attempting to seize land and threatening us, constitute criminal trespass and fraud. And since you escalated to physical assault when you pepper sprayed me, I've ensured that the authorities are fully aware of your conduct." Right on cue, 2 uniformed officers walked through the doors. The entire room went dead silent. The lead officer, holding a folded document, stepped up to Karen. "Ma'am, we need to have a word with you." Karen's confidence shattered instantly. "Wait, this is a misunderstanding. I was protecting the community. You don't understand." But the officer didn't wait. He handed her the warrant. "Karen Walters, you are under investigation for assault, harassment, and misuse of HOA authority. Please come with us." The crowd erupted. Some people clapped. Others shouted their frustrations, years of pent-up anger at Karen's bullying finally exploding into the open. Board members quietly shuffled their papers, looking like they wanted to vanish. Reporters swarmed forward, cameras flashing, microphones extended. Karen, red-faced and trembling, tried to resist, but the officers escorted her out firmly. Her voice trailed into incoherent shrieks as the doors closed behind her. The queen of the neighborhood had fallen, and she was leaving not in triumph but in disgrace. When silence returned, my father faced the residents. "I want to make something clear. I didn't move here to start a war with any of you. My family and I came here to live quietly. But when someone abuses power, it is the duty of those who see the truth to stand up against it. This neighborhood doesn't belong to one person, and it never should." The crowd erupted again, this time in applause. Some people stood, clapping vigorously. Others approached us afterward, shaking our hands, thanking us for standing up when no one else could. It was as if a heavy weight had been lifted off the entire community. The HOA board dissolved within a week. Without Karen's leadership, and with her legal troubles mounting, the entire structure collapsed. Neighbors began working together informally to handle small issues. Freed from Karen's tyranny, the community became more cooperative than it had ever been. As for Karen, her story spread far beyond our neighborhood. The video of her being escorted out by police went viral. The once powerful HOA president became a national symbol of arrogance and downfall. And while she fought desperately in court, her reputation was permanently destroyed. My father, meanwhile, finally got what he wanted: peace. With the HOA gone and the truth revealed, our land was safe, our home secure. He returned to his quiet routines, though every now and then he would chuckle when neighbors stopped by with stories of Karen's latest blunder in the news. I realized something important through all of this. Strength doesn't always come from fighting battles with fists or weapons. Sometimes, it comes from patience, strategy, and the courage to expose lies in front of everyone. Karen thought she was the smartest, the most powerful person in the room. But in the end, her arrogance blinded her. My father didn't need to shout or rage, he only needed to let the truth do its work. And so, the chapter of HOA Karen closed with the simplest yet most powerful lesson. Bullies can build walls of rules and fear, but those walls crumble the moment people stand united against them. The end.